The bell of St. Mary's Church had rung every dawn for 100 years, until one November morning, when it fell silent. Inside, a Bible lay open, a coat hung neatly on a chair, and a pair of shoes waited by the door. But the priest who should have worn them was gone, vanished without a trace. November 15th, 2012. A chill hung over the Ozark Hills, the kind that seeps through the cracks of old houses before dawn. In the small town of Miller's Crossing, mornings had a rhythm everyone trusted. At exactly 5 o'clock, the bell of St. Mary's Catholic Church rang out, echoing across the quiet valley. It had never failed, until that morning. Martha Reynolds, 72 years old and faithful as sunrise, stirred awake in her creaking farmhouse. For decades, her life had revolved around that bell. She sat up, listening for its familiar clang, but silence pressed against her walls instead. At first, she thought her alarm clock had betrayed her. She squinted. 5:10 a.m. No mistake. The bell had not rung. Across town, Sheriff's Deputy Mark Evans was finishing a long night shift in his patrol car. He knew the bell too. It usually drifted faintly through his rolled-down window as he drove Highway 14. But on this morning, only static from the radio kept him company. He muttered to himself, "Strange, never misses." By 5:15, Martha was already wrapping her heavy coat and shuffling down the frosty gravel road toward the church. Her breath puffed white in the air as she pushed open the front doors. They weren't locked. They never were when Father John Miller prepared for Mass. But the sanctuary was dark. No candles flickered, no rustle of vestments. Only the faint outline of the wooden cross above the altar glowed in the moonlight, slipping through stained glass. She called into the silence. Her voice trembled. "Father John?" No answer. Down the narrow hallway, his office door stood ajar. Inside, the desk lamp was cold, yet the Bible lay open on John 14, a sermon draft. Half written. Weighted beside it, his heavy winter coat hung neatly on the chair. By the door, his black shoes were placed side by side, as if waiting for him to return. But he was gone. When Martha staggered back into the cold, she clutched the railing as if the earth had tilted. In that instant, something sacred felt broken. By sunrise, word was already spreading through Miller's Crossing. Father John had vanished before dawn. Some whispered accident, others foul play, and a few dared to suggest something even darker. One truth remained. What should have been the most ordinary morning had become the beginning of a mystery no one in town would ever forget. Miller's Crossing wasn't the kind of place that appeared on maps unless you looked closely. Tucked deep into the Missouri Ozarks, it was more a cluster of families than a town. Wood frame houses with sagging porches, one diner, a gas station, and a church that stood taller than anything else for 20 miles, St. Mary's. The church was old brick, built by German immigrants a century ago. Its steeple once painted white but now faded to gray. For most of the townsfolk, St. Mary's wasn't just a house of worship. It was the heart of their fragile community. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, and potluck dinners all flowed through those doors. At the center of it all was Father John Miller. 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with the calm eyes of someone who had seen more than he spoke about. Before seminary, he'd served as a medic in Afghanistan. Some remembered the day he first arrived, still limping slightly from an old injury, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a Bible marked with colored tabs. "He's the kind who listens before he talks," said Tom Harris, the town's mayor and owner of the feed store. And in a place like this, that counts for a lot. Children knew him as the priest who played baseball on the schoolyard after catechism class. Widows knew him as the man who fixed their leaky roofs when no one else would. And men who carried scars from wars long past found in him someone who understood the weight of silence. Among his most faithful parishioners was Martha Reynolds, the elderly woman who had found his room empty that morning. To her, Father John was not just a priest, but a son she never had. "He prayed with me when my husband passed," she often told neighbors. "He's got God's patience in him." Life in Miller's Crossing moved slowly. People measured seasons, not by calendars, but by harvests and storms. And through every season, Father John was there, at hospital bedsides, in town meetings, at football games on Friday nights. His consistency gave people a sense of order, of safety, in a world that often seemed chaotic beyond their hills. That was why his disappearance struck like lightning. A man so dependable, so woven into the rhythms of town life, vanishing without warning. It was unthinkable. By late morning on November 15th, people began gathering at the diner, whispering over mugs of weak coffee. Sheriff's Deputy Mark Evans, still in his uniform from the night shift, fielded questions he couldn't answer. "He wouldn't just leave," muttered Sarah, the waitress, pouring refills with trembling hands. The air inside the diner grew heavy with unease. For once, the town that prided itself on knowing everyone suddenly realized they didn't know what had happened to the one man they trusted most. And outside, the silent steeple of St. Mary's loomed above the valley, no longer a symbol of certainty, but of an absence that begged to be explained. By the time the sun broke through the thin November clouds, a handful of townsfolk had already gathered near St. Mary's. They lingered in the churchyard, their boots crunching over frost, whispering as if afraid to disturb something sacred. The old wooden doors stood open, left that way by Martha Reynolds when she had gone in alone at dawn. Inside, the sanctuary was hushed. Dust motes floated in the pale light slanting through stained glass. The pews sat empty, polished, smooth by generations, but that morning they looked like rows of unanswered questions. Deputy Mark Evans stepped carefully down the aisle. His flashlight beam swept over hymnals stacked neatly in the racks, the unlit altar candles, the silence where a morning mass should have been. He paused at the sacristy door. It hung slightly open. Martha's voice trembled as she stood behind him. "I checked already, but maybe you'll see something I missed." The office of Father John Miller looked almost too ordinary. A desk cluttered with notes, a well-worn Bible open to John chapter 14, a page marked with underlined words. "Do not let your hearts be troubled." On the side table, a half-empty mug of coffee had grown cold. His heavy winter coat was draped neatly over the back of a chair. And by the door, his black dress shoes sat side by side, untouched, as if waiting for their owner to return. Deputy Evans crouched, studying the shoes. "No mud, no scuffs," he murmured, like he never left. Martha shook her head. He wouldn't walk out barefoot. Not in this cold. Another parishioner, Joe Carter, a farmer with calloused hands, leaned in. Maybe he stepped outside just for a minute, slipped into work boots or something. Evans checked the small closet. A few sets of clerical black shirts hung neatly. No boots, no sneakers, no duffel bag. Nothing missing. He swept his light across the floor. No overturned chair, no broken glass, no sign of struggle. It was as if Father John had risen from his desk, intending to return any second, and simply never did. On the wall hung a calendar. November 15th was circled in red ink. Scrawled across it were 3 words: Mass, 5 a.m. Evans flipped through the sermon notes, detailed, thoughtful, half-complete, the kind of preparation that spoke of a man planning for the future, not walking away from it. Martha pressed her hands together. "He'd never leave us without a word." "Never." The deputy said nothing. He felt the weight of the room pressing in. Like the air itself knew something was wrong. He pulled out his notepad and scribbled, "Bible open, coat left, shoes by door, no exit trace." Then he looked up. The sanctuary beyond the office was still and shadowed, its silence louder than any alarm. Whatever had taken Father John from this place had done so quietly, leaving only the echo of his presence and a mystery that was just beginning to unfold. By mid-morning, word had traveled faster than the wind through Miller's Crossing. A priest missing was not just news. It was shock, the kind that unsettled every kitchen table conversation, every stop at the gas pump. Mayor Tom Harris was in his feed store when the call came. His wife's voice was urgent, shaky. "Tom, you need to get down to St. Mary's. They can't find Father John." Minutes later, his pickup rattled into the churchyard. Outside, a half-dozen townsfolk lingered anxiously, their eyes darting toward the darkened windows. Harris stepped out, his jaw tight. He had known Father John as both a priest and a friend. Seeing Martha Reynolds clutching her shawl, pale and trembling, made the knot in his chest tighten. "Tell me straight," he asked Deputy Evans. "Is he here or not?" Evans shook his head. "Everything's in place, ain't Ross? Coat, Bible, sermon notes, but no Father John." The mayor rubbed his forehead. "So what are we saying? He just walked out?" "That's the problem," Evans replied quietly. "There's no sign he left at all." The murmurs among the crowd thickened into fear. Sarah, the diner waitress, pressed her hands together. "He baptized my grandbaby last month. He wouldn't just disappear," an old rancher muttered. "Maybe he had some emergency. Drove off in the night." But Evans cut in. "His truck's still parked out back. Keys are in the office drawer." Silence fell heavy across the group. Finally, Mayor Harris cleared his throat. "This isn't gossip anymore. We need to treat it for what it is. Call in the county." Heads nodded, reluctant but resolute. Martha whispered, almost to herself, "Lord, protect him." Within an hour, the sheriff's office in the nearest county seat was notified. What had begun as an unsettling absence was now officially declared a missing person case. By dusk, the steeple of St. Mary's no longer looked like the heart of the town. It loomed over Miller's Crossing like a question mark, casting a shadow of dread over everyone who passed beneath it. The county sheriff's office dispatched extra units by late afternoon. 2 cruisers rolled into Miller's Crossing, their red and blue lights flashing against the weathered brick of St. Mary's. The townsfolk, who had lingered at the edges of the churchyard all day, drew back, murmuring. Something about the sirens made the absence of their priest suddenly feel official. Real. Deputy Mark Evans walked alongside Sheriff Don Whitaker, a seasoned lawman with 30 years under his belt. Whitaker's heavy boots echoed on the church steps as he pulled the door wide and stepped into the dark sanctuary. "Doesn't look disturbed," Whitaker muttered. Evans nodded, leading him toward the office. "That's the strange part. Everything's just waiting." The sheriff scanned the desk. Bible open to John 14, sermon notes in neat handwriting, the mug of cold coffee. His eyes narrowed on the coat draped over the chair. He touched the sleeve. Thick wool. The man wasn't going anywhere without this in November. "And his shoes," Evans added, pointing to the polished black pair by the door. No footprints outside. No sign he left wearing anything else. Whitaker crouched low, running a gloved hand across the floorboards. No scuffs, no dragged dirt, no struggle. He stood, frowning, almost like he vanished straight out of this room. Evans shifted uneasily. "I checked his truck out back. Still parked. Keys inside the drawer. Wallet? Left in the top desk shelf. Cell phone's here too. Charger still plugged in." Whitaker let out a long breath. "Then we rule out voluntary disappearance. A man doesn't plan to vanish without shoes, keys, or money." Martha Reynolds, who had been hovering in the hallway, wrung her hands. "Sheriff, he'd never leave us. Not Father John. He was planning the Thanksgiving food drive just yesterday." Evans glanced at her gently. "We know, Martha. That's why we're taking this seriously." The sheriff ordered a sweep of the grounds. 2 deputies traced the perimeter, while Evans and a pair of volunteers searched the rectory basement. The concrete floor was bare, cold, and silent. Dust lay undisturbed. No doors or windows forced. As the day slipped into night, they canvassed neighbors. A truck driver on the highway reported seeing nothing unusual. A woman across the street claimed she heard faint voices around 2 a.m., but admitted she couldn't tell if it came from the church or the wind through the trees. By 10 o'clock, the report was grim. No footprints in the frosted grass, no signs of forced entry, no missing vehicle. It was as though Father John had stepped into the shadows and simply ceased to exist. Evans leaned against his patrol car, jotting notes under the beam of his flashlight. He listed the facts. Last seen November 14th, evening mass. Office intact, Bible open, coat and shoes left behind. Truck, phone, and wallet untouched. No struggle, no tracks, no noise. He paused, tapping his pen. Then he wrote a final line. No evidence of where he went or how. Sheriff Whitaker closed his notepad with a snap. Mark, this isn't just a missing person anymore. We might be looking at foul play. The younger deputy stared back at the looming silhouette of St. Mary's, its steeple stark against the moonlit sky. He felt the chill run through him, the kind that told him this was only the beginning. At dawn the next morning, Miller's Crossing awoke to the sight of strangers in uniform. Search and rescue trucks lined the churchyard. Volunteers from nearby towns arrived in muddy pickups, some leading hounds straining at their leashes. The sheriff's office set up a command post in the parish hall, maps spread across folding tables beneath the dim light of fluorescent bulbs. Sheriff Whitaker addressed the crowd of deputies, firemen, and townsfolk. We divide into 3 groups. North, cover the ridge and the old logging trail. East, take the road toward Benton County. South, sweep the creek and valley floor. We don't leave a yard unchecked. Martha Reynolds stood at the back of the hall, rosary beads wound tight in her fingers. She whispered prayers as young men strapped on headlamps and clipped radios to their belts. Her eyes never left the photograph of Father John taped to the wall. The first team pushed north, up into the woods. The trees closed in quickly, their bare November branches clawing at the sky. Among them was Joe Carter, the farmer, trudging with a walking stick. Father John hiked this ridge with me last spring, he muttered to Deputy Evans. He wouldn't have come up here in the middle of the night without boots. To the east, a second team walked the county road, flashlights sweeping ditches and barbed wire fences. The road led to larger highways, to the kind of places a man might hitch a ride unseen. Yet every footprint in the frosted dirt turned out to belong to cattle, not men. Southward, the third team waded into the valley where a narrow creek wound through frozen reeds. The water barely reached their ankles, but they scanned every bend for signs of a fall. Nothing, one firefighter called out, shaking his head. Even kids play here in summer. It's too shallow. Hours dragged on. The radios crackled with check-ins, but no breakthroughs. The dogs barked, circled, then sat down, confused. No scent to follow. By late afternoon, the searchers gathered back at St. Mary's, mud on their boots, faces lined with exhaustion. Sheriff Whitaker studied the reports. North Ridge, clear. East Road, clear. South Creek, clear. No tracks, no clothing, no signs. A silence spread. Volunteers shuffled their feet. Someone muttered, "A man can't just vanish." Evans slammed his notebook shut, frustrated. We covered miles. Not even a footprint. It doesn't make sense. At the edge of the crowd, Linda Price, the woman who claimed she saw a stranger near the church at dawn, spoke softly. What if he didn't walk out? What if someone took him? Heads turned. The possibility hung in the air, heavier than the November cold. Night fell early, the hills swallowing the last light. The teams packed up reluctantly, promising to return the next day. As the command post emptied, Martha remained seated in a pew, clutching her rosary. Her whispered plea floated through the hollow church. Lord, bring him back to us. Outside, frost spread across the windows. The steeple of St. Mary's rose into the dark sky, but offered no answers. Only the silence of a shepherd gone, and a mystery that deepened with every fruitless mile. The morning after the fruitless search, Sheriff Whitaker gathered his deputies in the parish hall. Maps still lay unfolded on the tables, but the lines of highlighter and circles from yesterday told only one story, nowhere left unexplored. The sheriff rubbed his temples. If we can't find him outside, maybe the answers are in what people saw. Or think they saw. That was when the testimonies began to surface. The first came from Henry Collins, 78, a retired logger whose small cabin sat at the northern edge of town. He shuffled into the hall with his cane tapping against the floorboards. I know what I saw, he insisted, voice gravelly. Around 4 in the morning, Couldn't sleep. Went out to the porch. There was someone in black, moving fast up the ridge trail. Not stumbling, not lost. Walking with purpose. Deputy Evans leaned forward. Are you sure it wasn't just a hunter? Henry shook his head. Not a chance. No rifle, no lantern, just black clothes, same kind Father John wore. The room stirred. If true, it placed the priest outside, walking into the woods at an hour when he should have been preparing Mass. But then came another account. Jim Blake, the town mechanic, spoke up at the diner that afternoon. Listen, I was working late in my shop, across from the church. Couldn't sleep, so I stayed up fixing an alternator. About 2 a.m., the lights in Father John's office were still on. I saw his shadow moving around. Looked like he was writing something. Deputy Evans frowned. If Father John was in his office at 2, how could he be on the ridge at 4? The contradictions didn't stop there. A third voice, Linda Price, a middle-aged woman who lived near the church parking lot, reported something different entirely. I let my dog out around 5. I saw someone near the church, standing by the lot. Tall man, had a cap pulled low. Didn't recognize him. Not one of ours, he just stood there, watching. Watching what? Evans asked. Watching the church, Linda whispered. The accounts collided like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. The sheriff's notes grew messy with arrows and question marks. Was Father John awake and working late into the night? Had he left before dawn, or had a stranger been prowling outside the church while the priest vanished inside? When reporters caught wind of the conflicting testimonies, the speculation multiplied. The Springfield Herald ran a headline. Priest seen walking into woods? Locals disagree. At the diner, customers argued over coffee refills. Some believed Henry's story of the ridge. Others swore Jim was right. Father John was still in his office at 2. A few whispered about Linda's stranger, turning him into a shadowy villain in their imaginations. Deputy Evans, buried under statements, felt the frustration rising. We don't just have one timeline. We've got 3, he muttered to Whitaker. And none of them agree. The sheriff snapped his notebook shut. Truth is in there somewhere. Pity him. But lies, mistakes, and memories play tricks in the dark. By nightfall, the testimonies had left the town more divided than before. Instead of clarity, Miller's Crossing was now caught in a web of rumor, suspicion, and doubt. Each voice pulling the mystery further from resolution. And as the church bell towered over them in silence, one thought echoed through every restless mind. If so many eyes were watching, how could no one know the truth? It began with a single reporter from the Springfield Herald, his sedan parked crooked on Main Street as he scribbled into a notepad. By the end of the week, Miller's Crossing felt less like a town and more like a stage. Satellite vans rumbled in, their dishes spinning toward the sky. National outlets. CNN, Fox, even a freelance crew chasing clicks, descended on the quiet valley. Cameras pointed at the brick steeple of St. Mary's, lenses glinting in the cold sun. For the first time in decades, Miller's Crossing made the evening news. A young priest vanishes without a trace in the Ozarks, the anchor's voice intoned over footage of deputies combing the woods. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of it. At the diner, where the bell above the door jingled nonstop, strangers with press badges crowded the counter, shoving microphones into anyone's face. Did you know him? They asked. Had he seemed troubled? Did he have enemies? Sarah, the waitress, exhausted from answering, snapped at one camera crew. He wasn't some celebrity. He was our priest. Her voice cracked. On social media, the story exploded. Hashtags trended. A Facebook group sprang up overnight. Find Father John. Theories spread faster than facts. Some posts claimed he'd been abducted by a cult. Others suggested he'd run off to start a new life. Darker corners of the internet spun tales of supernatural forces. The sheriff's office drowned in phone calls. People from as far as Texas and Ohio swore they had spotted a man in clerical black wandering highways, bus stations, homeless shelters. Each lead required hours of manpower to check, but none matched Father John. For the people of Miller's Crossing, The attention felt like salt in a wound. Martha Reynolds refused interviews, clutching her rosary tighter whenever reporters knocked at her door. Mayor Harris muttered at a town meeting, "We asked for help, not a circus." Yet the circus only grew. At night, teenagers from nearby counties dared each other to drive out and film TikToks in front of the church. They laughed nervously in the glow of their phones, whispering about ghosts and demons. Deputy Evans watched it unfold with rising frustration. The floodlights outside St. Mary's cast long shadows as journalists set up tripods, while inside the church the pews sat empty, waiting. "Every minute we spend answering rumors," he told Sheriff Whitaker, "is a minute we're not finding him." The sheriff nodded grimly. But there was no way to silence the noise. What began as a sacred mystery was now public spectacle. And beneath the blare of cameras and the hum of generators, the unanswered question still haunted every corner of town. Where was Father John? Winter settled hard over the Ozarks, blanketing Miller's Crossing in silence. The search parties dwindled, the reporters packed up, and the flashing lights that had lit the churchyard at night faded away. In their place came an emptiness far more unsettling. By December, Sheriff Whitaker filed his final report, "Missing person, unresolved." The words looked sterile on paper, but for those who had known Father John, they felt like a burial without a body. At Sunday services, fewer and fewer parishioners gathered. Some avoided St. Mary's entirely, uneasy beneath its steeple. Others whispered that stepping into the sanctuary now felt like walking into a tomb. Mayor Harris tried to reassure the townsfolk. "Life has to go on," he told them at the diner. But his own eyes betrayed the weight of something unfinished, a question gnawing at every corner of his town. Martha Reynolds still came to the churchyard each morning. She shuffled along the frosted path, rosary in hand, peering at the locked doors. Sometimes she sat on the steps for hours, murmuring prayers into the wind. To her, leaving meant giving up, and she couldn't. The building itself began to change. Paint peeled in strips from the wooden trim. A window cracked during a January storm, letting snow drift into the sacristy. By spring, weeds pushed through the walkway. The once vibrant parish was becoming a shell, abandoned not by choice but by grief. Deputy Evans, now back on his usual patrols, still drove past the church each night. He slowed his cruiser, staring at the dark silhouette against the moon. Every time, the same thought pressed against his mind: we failed him. As years passed, talk of Father John slipped into the hushed tones reserved for folklore. Children dared each other to peek through the church windows, whispering about ghosts. Newcomers heard the story only as rumor, never as reality. By the 10th anniversary, St. Mary's was no longer a sanctuary. It was a reminder, a hollow place that once held a shepherd. And the mystery of a man who walked into the night and never returned. 10 years passed. Seasons turned, roofs sagged, and weeds claimed the churchyard of St. Mary's. To most, the building was little more than a relic, a husk of brick and shadow at the edge of town. But in the spring of 2022, a new figure arrived to change that. Father Michael Rodriguez was 45, a man with salt and pepper hair and a voice that carried both authority and warmth. The diocese had sent him to reopen St. Mary's, to breathe life into what had become a wound on the landscape. When his dusty sedan pulled into the lot, townsfolk watched from porches with cautious eyes. On his first day, Michael stepped into the church and paused at the doorway. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, as if time itself had sealed the building. Sunlight cut through broken panes, illuminating rows of pews coated in neglect. Mayor Harris stopped by that afternoon. "Father," he said carefully, "you should know, this church carries a story, a heavy one." He explained what had happened a decade earlier, though he left many details unsaid. Michael nodded quietly, but his gaze lingered on the darkened sanctuary. "Sometimes," he replied, "God leaves mysteries for us to tend, not to solve." But tending required cleaning, and in the days that followed, Father Michael rolled up his sleeves. He swept floors, aired out the sacristy, and sorted through boxes left untouched for years. It was in the storage room, behind crates of hymnals yellowed with age, that he found a small tin box. Inside lay letters. Most were routine, diocesan memos, notes from parishioners, donations tucked into folded envelopes. But one caught his eye. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. There was no name, only an address postmarked from Chicago, dated November 11th, 2012. 4 days before Father John disappeared. The words were desperate. "Father, I cannot bear this anymore. Please help me. My life is in danger. I beg you, come before it's too late." Michael read the lines twice, then a third time. The plea was raw, urgent, impossible to ignore. He imagined John Miller opening the same letter a decade ago, the weight of someone else's survival pressing into his hands. He carried the letter to Martha Reynolds, now frailer at 82, but still faithful. She read it slowly, her lips trembling. "So he did leave for someone," she whispered. He went to help. The discovery reignited whispers in Miller's Crossing. Could this have been the reason? Did Father John leave quietly to save a life, only to vanish himself? For Father Michael, the letter was not proof but a spark. He placed it gently on the altar, beside a candle that had not burned in years. Its flame flickered high, casting shadows on the cracked walls. For the first time in a decade, St. Mary's felt alive again. Not with certainty, but with possibility. It was a gray afternoon in May, the kind where the sky hung low and the Ozark Hills seemed to exhale a weary breath. Father Michael Rodriguez sat inside the dim confessional of St. Mary's, waiting. He had announced reconciliation hours the week before, uncertain whether anyone in this half-abandoned parish would come. The door creaked. Slow footsteps shuffled across the floor. Someone eased into the booth, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Through the screen, Michael could only make out the outline of a hunched figure, shoulders trembling. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," came a voice, raspy with age. "It's been too long," Michael answered gently. "Take your time." There was silence, then a sigh that seemed to carry decades. 10 years I've kept this, locked in my chest. I lied to the sheriff, lied to my neighbors, lied to God. Michael leaned forward, the words cutting through him. "What truth have you hidden?" The man's voice quivered. "I saw him. The night Father John disappeared. I saw him in the churchyard." The air inside the booth grew heavy. "He wasn't alone," the old man continued. "There was another, a younger fellow, dressed in black. Couldn't see his face clear, but I watched them talking under the oak tree. At first it was quiet, then their voices rose. Kume? I heard just a few words. Chicago and danger." Michael's hand tightened around his stole. They walked off together, toward the ridge. Father John moved fast, like a man rushing to catch a train. The young one stayed close at his side. The man's breathing hitched. When the deputies came, I told them I saw nothing. I was scared. Scared of that stranger, scared of getting pulled into something dark. And when days passed and John didn't return, I thought maybe silence was safer. His voice cracked into a whisper. "But it's eaten me alive. Every night, I see them walk into the shadows, and every night I wonder, if I'd spoken then, would we have found him?" The booth fell into stillness, save for the faint ticking of the church's old clock. Michael spoke softly, but firmly. "You've carried this burden long enough. The truth is not too late. God's mercy waits for those who repent. And so does the truth that sets us free." The man sobbed quietly, shoulders shaking. At last, he murmured, "Then forgive me, Father. Forgive me for my cowardice." Michael granted absolution, but his mind burned with the confession. When the booth finally opened, the old man shuffled away, leaving the scent of damp wool and the echo of a secret no longer hidden. That evening, Michael sat in the rectory, the letter from Chicago beside him. He now held two pieces of the puzzle, a desperate plea for help, and the testimony of an old witness who had seen John Miller leave with a mysterious stranger. The timeline aligned too perfectly. November 11th, the letter. November 15th, the departure. Chicago, danger. A companion in the night. The answer was closer now. But so was the ache of knowing that the truth, even revealed, might never bring Father John back. The confession spread quietly through Miller's Crossing. Father Michael never revealed the man's name, but whispers carried in a town this small. For some, the revelation confirmed what they long suspected. That Father John had left on purpose, chasing someone who needed him. For others, it only deepened the ache of not knowing. 3 theories began to weave through conversations at the diner, the gas station, even in pews where Mass was held once more. The first, the most hopeful, Father John left to save a life. The letter from Chicago was real, its plea genuine. Perhaps he walked away that night because someone else was in mortal danger. That's the kind of man he was, Martha Reynolds told a reporter softly, always going where the hurt was deepest. The second theory carried a darker edge. He was deceived. The stranger in black, the late-night lights in the rectory. What if the letter was bait, a trap designed to lure him away? If so, Father John might have stepped into the woods not as a rescuer, but as prey. And the third, whispered reluctantly, he chose to leave. Could the burdens of war, ministry, and solitude have driven him to vanish? The theory never sat well with those who knew him. He wouldn't abandon us, Mayor Harris said firmly. Not without a word. Each possibility had its defenders. None carried proof. What remained certain was the void he left behind. A man whose days were spent mending roofs, praying at hospital bedsides, teaching children to throw baseballs. Gone without explanation. Yet even in absence, his life continued to shape those around him. Father Michael often ended Mass with a reflection. We may never know what happened on that November night, he told the congregation one Sunday. But we know why Father John lived the way he did. He placed love above comfort, service above safety, and perhaps that was his final act. Stepping into uncertainty so that another might have a chance to live. In the churchyard, beneath the oak tree where the old witness claimed to have seen 2 figures speak, a small wooden cross was planted. Carved into it were the words, "Gone in love, remembered in faith." Children who had never met him asked their parents about the priest who disappeared. The story became part of Miller's Crossing's identity. Not just a mystery, but a parable. At night, when the valley grew still, townsfolk sometimes swore they could hear the echo of the bell that failed to ring on that November morning, a sound that wasn't there, yet lingered in memory. Perhaps Father John's body was lost. Perhaps the truth of his fate would remain forever cloaked in shadows. But his spirit, the spirit of a man who once walked barefoot into the cold for reasons only heaven may know, remained alive in the community he left behind. And in that lingering presence, Miller's Crossing found not closure, but something just as enduring, a call to live with the same courage, the same love that had led their priest into the dark. Turnani. And so the mystery of Father John Miller remains. Unfinished, unanswered, suspended somewhere between faith and silence. Yet even in that silence, his life still speaks, a reminder that love often calls us into the unknown, and courage sometimes means walking a road no one else can see. If this story touched you, if it stirred something in your heart, we invite you to join us on this journey. Here on Silent Traces, we share stories of faith, mystery, and the unseen ways God moves among us. Click like if this story stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss the next journey we share. And most of all, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that love never truly disappears. Because in the end, remembering together is how grace continues to live among us.